if you want to get away with murder, don't do it in a dark alley.
Right.
Do it in the single most heavily monitored, brightly lit, like hyper-secure room inside a government facility.
Yeah, it's totally backwards.
Because apparently if you do it there, the system might just, well, they might just throw their hands up years later and let you walk away.
It really is a staggering contradiction, you know? I mean, you expect a lockdown, government-run environment to have absolute surveillance.
Exactly. Accountability.
Right. But the reality of what happens when that system completely breaks down is what brings us to the table today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're unpacking a story that completely upends everything you might assume about institutional accountability. We are looking at the really tragic case of Delmara Shelley.
Yeah, and to piece it all together for you, we've pulled from a very specific stack of sources today.
Right. We're looking at local news reports, so like 13 WMAZ and the Macon Telegraph, plus official public statements from the Bibb County Sheriff's Office, detailed court filings, and some incredibly eye-opening documented testimonies from former detainees.
And our focus today is to thoroughly understand this timeline. We are looking at the June 2022 death of Shelley, and then the shocking June 2026 dismissal of charges against his accused killer, Joseph Anthony Moore.
Yeah.
And crucially, why this complete legal collapse has triggered what we're basically calling a public records emergency.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp why the collapse of this case is so alarming, we have to start with the baseline facts of the crime itself, right? Like, what was the prosecution actually dealing with on day one?
Well, we need to go back to June of 2022. Delmara Shelley was 48 years old, and he was being held at the Bibb County Jail.
All right.
His bond was set at $6,600, which he hadn't posted. So, he wasn't serving a sentence. He was simply in custody awaiting the legal process.
Just waiting. And he was placed in a suicide watch cell. And I really want to pause on that detail because, well, it changes the entire geometry of the story.
It changes everything.
Right. Because if you put someone on suicide watch, you are officially declaring that they are highly vulnerable. They require maximum observation.
That designation is everything. And in June 2022, Shelley was found dead inside that very cell. Now, historically, in custody, deaths in challenging environments, they can sometimes be hastily labeled as suicides by the institution.
Sure. It's the easier path.
Exactly. But the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, they brought in their medical examiner, and the official ruling was unequivocal.
Yeah.
Shelley's death was a homicide by strangulation.
So there's no ambiguity there. The medical examiner essentially says, look, this man did not do this to himself. He was murdered.
Right.
And following that ruling, the Bibb County Sheriff's Office charges Shelley's cellmate, Joseph Anthony Moore, with aggravated assault and felony murder.
And the details surrounding the incident, they're just deeply unsettling. If we look at a civil lawsuit connected to this case, it highlights a piece of ear witness testimony.
Right, the guy next door.
Yeah, an inmate housed in the cell right next to Shelley. And Moore reported hearing Shelley gasping for air.
Ugh.
And even more chilling, during the attack, the inmate alleged that Moore said out loud, "Tell my grandmother I love her."
Wow. That detail just, it stops you cold.
It really does.
But setting the horror of that aside for just a second, I keep getting stuck on the logistics here. Because a suicide watch cell is supposed to be the equivalent of a bank vault. It's stripped down, heavily monitored, with 0 blind spots. So how does a violent, hands-on homicide happen in the one place designed specifically to keep a person alive?
Well, that's exactly what implicates the institution's operational procedures from top to bottom. A murder in a suicide watch cell isn't just about the person committing the violence.
Right.
The facility's own operating policies mandate 15-minute checks for inmates placed on suicide watch.
Right, 15 minutes. A guard is supposed to physically look at you 4 times an hour. And, strangulation is not like a gunshot.
No, not at all.
It's not instantaneous. It is a prolonged physical struggle.
Which is why the timeline itself becomes an indictment of the oversight here. If a prolonged struggle resulting in death occurs in a room requiring 15-minute visual checks, well, the foundation for institutional liability is instantly established.
Yeah, the math simply doesn't work in the jail's favor.
Exactly.
So the prosecution seemingly has this rock-solid foundation, right? They have a body. They have an unequivocal medical examiner's ruling of homicide. They have the accused cellmate in the room and an ear witness in the next cell over.
Right.
It sounds like a grim but incredibly straightforward case for a DA to take to trial. But then we fast forward 4 years to June 2026, and the state just They just walk away.
Yeah, and a resolution that's done pretty much everyone observing. Prosecutors with the Macon Judicial Circuit DA's office abruptly dropped all charges against Joseph Anthony Moore.
Just completely drop them.
The aggravated assault, the felony murder, totally gone.
I mean, how does a prosecutor justify dropping a murder case involving a victim who was literally locked inside state custody at the time of the crime?
Well, the DA's office filed a brief, like a 3-page motion, to outline their reasons. And they cited 2 primary justifications. First, they mentioned adverse rulings handed down by Judge David Mincy.
Okay.
And second, they cited severe witness problems.
Well, hold on. Witness problems. I mean, that sounds like bureaucratic cover for a botched investigation. What did they actually mean by that? Are they saying their entire case rested on just a single person?
That is essentially what they admitted.
Seriously?
Yeah. The state revealed that their sole eyewitness to the murder, the only person they were relying on to place Moore as the attacker, was currently incarcerated at Central State Hospital.
Oh, wow.
And this witness was undergoing what the legal system calls a restoration process.
A restoration process, meaning they are receiving heavy psychiatric treatment to become mentally competent to stand trial for a completely separate criminal case.
Exactly. The state's star witness was deemed legally incompetent to even understand reality, let alone testify in a murder trial. And Moore's defense team saw this massive vulnerability immediately. They actually filed a motion signaling their intent to blame the murder of Carlos Shelley on that very same mentally incompetent eyewitness.
They flipped the script completely.
Totally flipped it.
Okay, here's where my alarm bells are ringing, though. If the state's entire murder case inside a modern operational jail facility rested on the testimony of just one compromised, legally incompetent eyewitness, doesn't that inherently mean the rest of the evidence was just completely missing?
Well, yeah.
I mean, where's the physical forensics? Where are the logs from the guards doing their 15-minute checks? Where's the video surveillance from the suicide watch block?
It all comes down to the burden of proof. The prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
And when your only eyewitness falls apart, a strong case pivots to the physical environment, right? Forensics, camera footage, electronic door logs, guard shift logs.
Yeah, the hard data.
Exactly. So when the state admits they can no longer meet their burden of proof, the inevitable conclusion is that those institutional records were either non-existent, inadmissible in court, or so severely compromised. They were just useless.
Wow.
The absence of that foundational evidence is what ultimately sank this prosecution.
So the criminal case collapses, and you might think the story ends there, right? The DA closes the file, Moore isn't prosecuted for this crime, and everyone just moves on. But the collapse of the criminal case means the battleground just shifts. We move from the criminal court to the court of public transparency.
And this is a really crucial distinction for you, the listener, to keep in mind as we navigate this. The dismissal of these charges does not equate to absolute proof of a massive cover-up.
Right.
It doesn't prove the deliberate, malicious destruction of evidence, nor does it establish Moore's factual innocence. Jumping to those conclusions based solely on a dropped charge is, well, it's premature.
Yeah, we aren't here to spin wild conspiracy theories about guards shredding documents in the dead of night. But this dismissal creates something else entirely. It creates an immediate public records emergency. The public urgently needs to see the actual court record to understand exactly why a locked room murder case became untriable.
When a system fails this spectacularly, the paper trail is the only diagnostic tool left. There are very specific documents the public needs to demand right now.
Like what?
We need the more criminal docket. We need to see the formal dismissal filing, which is legally known as a nolle prosequi. We need the hearing transcripts, the civil discovery motions, and perhaps most importantly, any specific orders from Judge Mincy detailing exactly what those adverse rulings were.
Right, because adverse rulings could mean a million things. It's like a commercial flight getting canceled at the very last minute while you're sitting at a gate.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, you don't immediately assume the plane was sabotaged by a rogue mechanic, but you absolutely demand to see the maintenance logs to find out exactly why they decided it wasn't safe to fly. If a murder case in a county jail gets canceled, we need the jail's maintenance logs. We need to know what broke.
And demanding that paper trail is the absolute bedrock of civic accountability. A nolle prosequi, that formal abandonment of the charges, is often a gold mine of information because prosecutors usually have to justify their retreat in writing.
Right.
The public deserves to know if the judge's adverse rulings happened because jail records never existed, because they were suspiciously altered, or because they were gathered so unprofessionally they became legally radioactive.
So the records are the key. But to really grasp how a modern jail could possibly lack the basic evidence to prosecute a locked-room homicide, we need to look at what the physical environment is actually like inside that building.
Yeah, it's wild.
And our sources introduce us to a figure who documented the facility's systemic infrastructure failures from the inside.
We need to bring Stephen Todd Faircloth into the picture here. He is a pro se litigant, meaning he represents himself in legal matters, and he operates as an investigative journalist. And Faircloth was detained in the Bibb County Jail for 72 days in the summer of 2024.
Now, I want to be abundantly clear about this for anyone listening. Stephen Faircloth was not a direct eyewitness to Carlos Shelley's death.
Right. Important point.
He was not in the jail in June 2022.
That is vital context. Faircloth is not offering testimony about the murder itself. What he provides is vital pattern and practice evidence.
Pattern and practice, okay.
He documented the jail's physical and operational environment, which speaks directly to the mechanics of how a murder could happen in the first place and why the supporting evidence wouldn't exist.
And the mechanics he documented are honestly staggering. He reported extensively on the jail's magnetic cell door locks. He claims these are 40-year-old locking mechanisms that just continuously fail.
Yeah.
And we aren't talking about a tricky deadbolt. These are systems where the electromagnets degrade, the alignments shift, and they become so non-functional that inmates could simply push the heavy steel gates open and roam freely around the cell blocks.
And Faircloth specifically connects this mechanical failure to the danger the inmates faced. In his documentation, he explicitly cites these non-functional locks as the mechanism that allowed inmates unrestricted access to each other.
Wow.
He actually points to this broken lock system as the exact reason Joseph Anthony Moore was able to access Carlos Shelley.
He also documented other systemic issues, particularly regarding how the physical reality of the jail conflicts with official narratives. Like, he noted that the jail issues thick blankets to inmates.
Right.
These blankets are rigid and nearly impossible to tie into knots, unlike standard thin bed sheets. And he also documented that the sprinkler heads in the cells couldn't possibly hold the weight of a human body.
He's highlighting the physical contradictions. By pointing out the limitations of the blankets and the plumbing, he's basically arguing that the environment itself makes a traditional suicide by hanging highly improbable.
Yeah.
He presents this as evidence that the physical realities of the room are sometimes ignored when deaths are hastily labeled as suicides.
So even though Faircloth wasn't there for the murder in 2022, his documentation from 2024 operates like a building inspector walking into a warehouse after a devastating fire. The inspector didn't see the spark that started the blaze, but they can look around and see the faulty wiring, the broken smoke detectors, and the chained-up fire exits.
Exactly.
They can prove that the environment made a catastrophic fire absolutely inevitable.
Faircloth's observations completely shift our understanding of this story. It moves from an isolated, unpredictable tragedy involving two men to a predictable catastrophe born of a failing environment.
Yeah.
In law, there's a concept of systemic failure. When physical infrastructure like massive steel doors that literally do not lock combines with severe overcrowding and poor guard supervision, the institution itself becomes the danger.
Right.
It is no longer just about one violent individual. It's about an ecosystem that facilitates violence.
And when an institution becomes the danger, the consequences don't just vanish into thin air because a criminal charge gets dropped. The criminal case against Moore collapsed in June 2026. But the financial and civil consequences of these institutional failures remain very real, and they sit squarely on the shoulders of the taxpayers.
And this brings us to the broader legal fallout. Carlos Shelley's family is currently suing the Bibb County Sheriff's Office in a massive civil action. They are seeking $5 million in damages.
$5 million?
Yeah. And their core argument rests entirely on those operational policies we discussed earlier. They argue that simply following basic state-mandated policies, specifically conducting those 15-minute suicide watch checks, would have prevented his death.
And when you zoom out from Shelley's case and look at the broader context provided in our sources, you realize his death isn't a tragic anomaly in an otherwise peaceful, well-run facility. The data is completely alarming.
Oh, it's terrible.
The jail saw over 80 assaults in 2023 and over 80 again in 2024.
Compare that to the recent past. There were just 16 aggravated assault incidents reported in 2020 and 16 in 2021.
Right.
So the rate of violence has just skyrocketed.
And it isn't just the violence between inmates either. Grand jury reports have detailed broken plumbing, incredibly poor lighting, and severe sanitary issues.
Right.
We know that Sheriff David Davis and Mayor Lester Miller had to publicly address severe overpopulation in the facility. They were even exploring releasing eligible detainees on ankle monitors just to ease the sheer crowding inside the building.
And amidst this environment of overcrowding and failing infrastructure, our sources highlight a very stark, very troubling contrast in how money is actually managed.
Yeah, this part is crazy.
There are widespread reports of internal deprivation. Inmates report they have no blankets, that they receive only 2 meager meals a day, and that basic medical care is severely delayed.
But at the exact same time, hundreds of thousands of dollars from the inmate commissary funds are being generously spent on, quote-unquote, therapeutic items and equipment outside the jail. So the funds generated by the inmates buying overpriced soap and ramen are flowing out to purchase items for the corrections division at large, while the people locked inside are lacking basic human necessities.
It paints a picture of totally misaligned priorities. Institutional revenue seems to be prioritized over basic habitability, security, and the safety of the people in state custody.
So, tying this all together for you, we have a dropped criminal murder case, a documented history of 40-year-old broken locks, skyrocketing assault numbers, and a $5 million lawsuit. If the criminal prosecution against the cellmate is dead and buried, is this civil lawsuit the only avenue left for the public to actually force the county to hand over the internal jail records?
The short answer is yes. Civil discovery is now the absolute front line for transparency here. In a criminal trial, the prosecutor's focus is on proving the defendant's guilt. But in a civil suit, like the one filed by the Shelley family, the plaintiff's focus is on proving the institution's negligence. When a system is caught red-handed failing its own mandates, like failing to secure doors or conduct mandated visual checks, civil suits are often the only powerful tool left to pry open the black box of institutional secrecy.
Because in a civil suit, you can subpoena everything.
Exactly. Through the discovery process, the county can be legally compelled to produce the very maintenance logs, the staffing records, the camera footage, and the internal communications that the public desperately needs to see.
It's the legal mechanism to force them to hand over the airplane maintenance logs.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. Well, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. Let's just summarize the journey we've taken through these sources. A 48-year-old man, Carlos Shelley, was strangled to death in a suicide watch cell.
Right.
A place that by all legal definitions should have been the safest, most monitored room in the county. The medical examiner confirmed it was a homicide. The cellmate was charged with murder. But 4 years later, that case completely collapsed.
It collapsed due to an over-reliance on a single legally incompetent witness, combined with those undisclosed adverse rulings from a judge that ultimately made the prosecution's burden of proof impossible to meet.
And behind that legal collapse is a grim, extensively documented backdrop, an environment where 40-year-old magnetic locks chronically failed to keep cell doors shut, where assaults have quintupled, and where systemic infrastructure neglect seems to be the baseline operating procedure.
It represents a profound failure of the basic social contract regarding state custody. When the state removes your freedom, they assume absolute responsibility for your safety.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, there's a final lingering thought we want to leave you with. Carlos Shelley's case is a horrific tragedy, but it made the news.
Yeah.
There was a body, an autopsy, a formal murder charge, and a public dismissal. His name is on the public record.
Which leads to a very disturbing question. If a murder case with an actual body, an identified suspect, and an ear witness can quietly evaporate into legal fog simply due to witness problems and a lack of usable evidence, how many other incidents are happening completely in the dark?
That is the real chilling thought here. How many other acts of violence, how much severe medical neglect, how many daily rights violations inside the Bibb County Jail simply never make it to a courtroom at all?
Exactly.
If they can't gather the evidence to prove a murder in a brightly lit, monitored suicide cell, what happens when it's just an assault in a crowded, unmonitored block?
The absence of evidence in court is not the evidence of safety in the jail. It is often simply the evidence of a system that has stopped keeping track of its own failures.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We know these are heavy, complex topics, but understanding the actual mechanics of these systems, how the locks fail, how the courts retreat, how the records disappear, is how you stay genuinely well-informed.
Right.
Remember, true accountability doesn't end just because a prosecutor decides to drop a charge. That is the exact moment accountability begins.
It begins by demanding the public record.
Because if the bank vault is left wide open, and the system refuses to explain why, well, we all have a fundamental right to demand the answers. Until next